Welcome everyone, and thank you, Hannah, for that very kind introduction. It was such a kind introduction, I'm really looking forward to hearing myself speak. The word lecture sort of puts me into a cold sweat, and I immediately think of the memories of endless, mind-numbingly boring hours that I spent in the anatomy lecture theatre at Aberdeen University. And this has sort of left me psychologically scarred. And so therefore I've decided that tonight is not a lecture. There are no bullet points. There are definitely no handouts. So you'll need to pay attention. In the audience we've got lots of very important people. Well, everyone's important here, but there are two especially important people I'd like to welcome. One is Gordon Simmons, who really knows about the Walker Cup, and he authored the definitive text, the Walker Cup, golf's finest contest. I'm glad he could be here tonight, although I'd have to say he's a little bit overdressed for the occasion. The other person is Sandy Sadler, who's come all the way down from Forfar this evening. And I would hazard a guess that Sandy has the best Walker Cup record in the audience. He played in 3 Walker Cups, 63, 65 and 67. And he played in 6 singles matches, winning 3, halving 2 and losing 1. That's a formidable record. I have another old friend in the audience who phoned me up with a message of support, and he said he would bring his duvet and his pillow with him. So my main aim this evening is to make sure that he manages to stay awake. This is not the story just of a golf match. It's the story of a nation recovering from a devastating war. It's the story of 3 ambitious, influential men who were determined to internationalize the game of golf. And it's also the story of the modernization of golf administration and the Royal and Ancient Golf Club of St Andrews, dragging it somewhat reluctantly from the 19th to the 20th century. The early 1920s were a watershed moment in the world of golf, and not just in the amateur game but in the professional game. The balance of power shifted across the Atlantic. The professional team that came over in 1921, culminating in Jock Hutchinson winning the Open Championship at St Andrews, coincided with the amateur team that came over. World War I cast a long shadow over British sport, and the last thing they had on their minds was to play golf during those long, dark years. This one? Okay. This is William Norman Bose. Norman Bose was one of the great men of St Andrews. He was the first chairman of the R&A Championship Committee. Prior to 1920, all the championship stuff at the R&A was organised by the Green Committee. And the Amateur Championship and the Open Championship were actually organised by the clubs, all likely supervised by the R&A. So 1920 was the first championship committee of the R&A. And Norman Bose was a great diplomat and golf administrator, and he was ably assisted by Henry Gullen, his secretary. They transformed the R&A organisationally, and they were huge men. In 1920, an American delegation from the USGA came over to the UK, and they had meetings with the R&A primarily around the 1920 Amateur Championship at Muirfield, And the 1920 Amateur Championship at Muirfield was the first amateur championship since the Great War. And at Muirfield, Bose met with George Herbert Walker, and Walker was then the president of the USGA, and they discussed informally the possibility of an international golf competition. And Bose was said to be broadly supportive of that. He was a great man. Later on in life, he became the Provost of St Andrews, 1927 to 1936. He was awarded the CBE, and he was captain of the Armour in 1935. He is one of the unsung heroes of Scottish golf between the wars. This is William C. Fones Jr. Some describe him as the father of American golf, but I'm not sure if he really was, but he was very, very influential. He was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was the third generation of a steel magnate family. He was a very keen golfer. He was a great golfer. And he won the US Amateur in 1910 at Brookline. He was at the vanguard of American team golf, and in 1919 and 1920 he led American teams against the Canadians. One home match, one away match, and he was really keen on popularizing and traveling with the Americans. In 1921 he'd arranged for 8 of the top American amateurs to come to the UK, primarily to play in the 1921 Amateur Championship at Hoylake, and thereafter, 3 weeks later, coming up to St Andrews. Most of them had planned to play in the 1921 Open Championship. That was the reason they arranged passage and came over. However, Fones had made it known to the powers that be of the time at the Army that they were seeking to oppose an amateur team from Great Britain. So they corresponded, and at this time Royal Liverpool had offered to revive the Scotland versus England Amateur International, which was usually played before the Amateur Championship. And all the arrangements had been set in place and everything was set to go. And they then had this communication from the Americans. And Gullen's letter, this is in response, 4th of May 1921, the Americans were on the boat at this time. Everything was last minute, nothing was really planned. I have to say, however, that the Americans who were coming over from the championship wished to meet a team from Great Britain. We cannot refuse to meet the Americans, as this would show a lack of courtesy. And I think that was probably the right decision. Norman Bose was very insistent that having 2 international matches before a strenuous championship would be too exhausting. So they abandoned international. And also the Americans just helped us win the war, so it was probably reasonable to host them. The next slide. Okay, just for a little bit of colour. That's a Coronia, Cunard line, and that was the ship that the Americans took in their passage, sailed from New York to Liverpool, and it was a 7-day passage. Okay, so one of my favourite pictures on board the Coronia. And this is them waving goodbye. I think that almost certainly it's a farewell rather than an arrival, and it's an absolutely fantastic picture. And these were perhaps the most talented, influential group of American golfers to travel internationally. Bones is on the left. He was the captain. He's age 44. Next to him, John Wood Platt, who was also from Pennsylvania. Francis Ouimet, famous Francis Ouimet, who was an amateur, won the 1913 US Open Championship at Brookline. He was an amateur, beating Pedre and Harry Barton in the playoff. Next to him in the middle, holding his hat up is Jess Gilbert, also from Massachusetts, and he was known as the Boston Siege Gun because he hit it so far. He was an enormous hitter. Next in line is a very young baby of the team, 19-year-old BobbyJones, full of youth, energy, and confidence. Far right is Dr. Paul Hunter, who was a physician from California, and he was the reigning state California amateur champion. There are two people missing. Chick Evans, who was also in the team, I'll mention him later. He travelled to Southampton. I'm not sure exactly why he did that, but he joined up with the team later. And Fred Wright, who was the other member of the team, and I just presume that he's the photographer, so he's not in that picture. Between them, they would either hold or go on to win 6 US Opens, 10 US Amateurs, and they were a gifted side in the extreme. Okay, so here we have the British team. Lots of interesting people there. This team reflected and personified really the profile of golf at the time in Great Britain. They were all privately schooled, they were all university educated, and 4 of them were either undergraduates or alumni of Oxford University, namely Wethered, Tully, Holderness, and Montmorency. There were 3 Scots, there were 5 Englishmen. But the difference really is that most of them had been to war, and many of them had seen active service. And the most remarkable one really is Tommy Armour, top left. And he was, the tank in which he was travelling in the war was directly hit with a mustard gas shell, and he lost his sight in one eye. He was temporarily blind in the other eye. He's got a metal plate in his arm. He got a severe head injury, and he was very nearly dead when they cut him out of the mud. And he took up golf really just to aid his rehabilitation after the war. JLC Jenkins from Troon, second from the second bottom from the left. He was wounded twice, invalided twice. And Polly next to him also served in the Tank Corps, and he was awarded the Military Cross. So they'd all seen a bit in the war. And if we contrast golf in America to golf in the UK, the Americans' competition was only postponed for 2 years, 1917, 1918. And golf pretty much went on as per normal, unless they did. Very few of the Americans actually saw action. And also in America, which is probably something that the British didn't realize, but the regional golf events were very well organized. State championships have been going since the turn of the century. In Massachusetts, California, Pennsylvania. In the UK, the Scottish Amateur didn't start till 1922, way after this. And in England, the first amateur championship was 1925. So by 1920, American golf was more competitive, it was better organized than we had in America. The next slide. This is another picture of the American team. This is in practice, I believe. They've all got their game faces on. This is obviously before lunch, and so they're a little bit uptight, and they're not sure what's going to happen to them. But this is my favorite picture. This is the American team, and this is an iconic picture of the American side of 1921 in front of the clubhouse at Hoylake. And if you look at the foreground, I'm not sure if you can see it from the back, but the course was dried out. It's a dusty, dry, arid course anyway. and it was dried out, and there was sand blowing all over the place. And but this is a group of confident young golfers, smiling, chatting, relaxed, having fun. Golf shoes gleaming, in contrast to the British team. They're well turned out, and they epitomised and represented really what was to become the Roaring Twenties in America. Golf psychology and body language had yet to be invented, but one look at this team showed that they're confident and they mean business. I could go on forever about a lot of these players, but the back right, this is the first picture we see of Chick Evans. Chick Evans was from Chicago. He was born in Minneapolis, but he's native of Chicago. And he was a great player. 1916 he won the US Open and the US Amateur in the same year, and great player. And he wrote a book called Chick Evans' Golf Book, which is not very original, but it was a very successful book. And he also did a golf instruction film, and he made quite a lot of money. And he was unable to use this money, otherwise he'd breach his amateur status. So he put it all into a trust fund. And if you look at all these men, there are 4 or 5 of them, Evans, Ouimet, Woodplatt, Jones, they all gave an awful lot of their money that they made at this particular time for scholarships. So and many of them are still going today, Caddy scholarships, university scholarships. They were hugely influential, and they left a great legacy to American golf. Interestingly, Ouimet back left, who I mentioned, the 1913 US Open champion. In 1916, he was deemed to have breached his amateur status by the USGA because his business was a sporting goods business, and they felt that through his golf connections and his fame, he would actually benefit financially from the game of golf. So they stripped him of his amateur status. Controversially, and it took a year of haggling and corresponding and lobbying to actually get that overturned and get his amateur status back. But he, rather than Bones, was probably the father of American amateur golf. He also went on to become the captain of the Armour in 1951, becoming the first non-UK based player to become captain of the Armour, and obviously the first American also. The next slide. Okay. This is something, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this that well from the back, but this is something that we unearthed fairly recently at Hoylake, and it's a telegram that was sent to Tolly on the eve of the match, and it says it's addressed Golf Club Hoylake near Liverpool. So it eventually got to Tolly, and it says England expects and we are confident, best of luck both. And if this isn't a very good example of English hubris and overconfidence, I really don't know what is. But I've been living down there for about 30 years, and I'm used to this sort of thing. The Darwin was the golf writer, the golf correspondent of the day from the Times, and in the lead up to the match, the American invasion it was called, he followed every game in practice, and he hadn't seen any of these players before, and day by day he, as he experienced, he put down their scores and he saw how they were getting on, and he had increasing respect day by day for the American team. And Jones had a reputation anyway, and the Jones and Evans and Ouimet. Darwin, by the time the match came along, was pretty concerned. but I would have to say that he was the only one that was concerned, and the rest of the press thought that this would just be business as usual, and the Americans don't play foursomes, and they just couldn't be used to these dry, bouncy links conditions, and it would be fairly straightforward. But as we'll see, it probably wasn't. But okay, this is a nice picture. This is from the match, and this is really to demonstrate the sort of size of the crowds in 1921. So the British sporting public had been completely deprived of sport, live sport, and they turned out. It took golf a long time to get going after the war, but they turned out in large numbers, and the O.B. Keeler, who travelled with Jones and was Jones's Boswell really, he wrote books on Jones. He was Jones's mentor and supporter throughout his life, and he said that when they came to Hoylake, that about Jones, his beautiful steep pitch shots bounded from the baked putting surfaces as if from cement, and he had not acquired the deft and useful run-up approach that is an absolute necessity in dry and windy weather. As a concession, several buckets of water were poured about the pin on one of the driest surfaces, so a golf ball may be eased up and stopped somewhere near the hole. So they're fairly treacherous, linksy conditions that they experienced. The next slide this is our Alps green, and this is a match. Ouimet and Gilbert playing Tolley and Holderness, and that's Ouimet in the front left on the green. He's the one with the sort of funny beanie hat. So this is the one that we have been able to identify. And, this Alps green at Hoylake no longer exists. This was a blind shot over the top of a hill, and it was quite a cool little hole, 11th hole at Hoylake. It's still called the Alps, but the events of 1921 and this particular match and the amateur championship that followed was a real low point for our course, and it was in pretty terrible condition, partly because it had been ignored for 6 or 7 years during the war. But it wasn't a good time for Hoylake, and the powers that be then decided that we need to do something about it, and so they then contacted Harry Colt, who moved some of these greens into the sandhills, certainly on the second nine, and they were transformational. And have gone a long way to make Hoylake the course it is today. Right, this is a report from the Illustrated London News. Top left and top right, you've already seen those pictures. There's a great picture of Tolley playing a recovery shot. Tolley was a sort of poster boy. All the journalists liked him, and he was brash. He was. He was the next big thing. He had actually won the 1920 amateur championship at Muirfield. He was an undergraduate. But I think playing out of bunker, smoking a pipe is absolutely brilliant. The other thing to note is there are 3 sort of follow-through pictures peripherally. Phones Wright and Gilbert. And they're all posed pictures, and because the camera, if you tried to take an action picture, you wouldn't see very much. So these were all posed. That's why they've all got perfect follow-throughs. But that's rather fun. I actually got the original of this from Australia in eBay, which was great. And we didn't know this even existed before the research we did. This is another nice picture. This is the 15th green, and this is the end of the match, the denouement of the match. Jenkins and Simpson playing Evans and Jones, And the Scots were so traumatised, they forgot to take their hats off before they shook hands. But if anyone, some of you I'm sure have played representative golf, foursomes and singles, which is still the way they do it today, and you're well aware how important it is to get off to a good start in the foursomes, and as you can see, they didn't get off to a very good start. So they were 4-0 down at lunch, and with the exception of Evans and Jones, they were completely irresistible. They had a run of figures on the front nine, and they were out in 33 or 34, and Darwin was said they were completely unbeatable, but the rest of them didn't really show up for whatever reason. And the Darwin was particularly critical of Tommy Armour, who said he played with completely no regard whatsoever for his playing partner. I'm sure you've all played with foursomes partners like that. And he said, he did his column, obviously at lunchtime, and the first half of the column is in the Times report. And he said, at present, it is impossible not to be depressed. So he's having a bit of a low time to himself, and so things perked up a little bit in the afternoon. And Darwin may have been especially concerned because he was actually one of the selectors of this particular team. So he was pretty scathing about some of the performances, but right moments in the afternoon, they won 3 matches, Holly, Armour and Aylmer, and so they finished off losing 9 matches to 3. And Darwin quoted, he said, there was at least one bright spot in the singles, and it was a really bright one. This was Mr. Tolley's golf against Mr. Evans. One would never have recognised in him the bored and erratic player of the morning. His carriage was superb, menacing and Napoleonic, every inch a champion. So Tolley redeemed himself in the afternoon, but Darwin was pretty much suicidal. It may be that our players' form is too bad to be true. Some of them fail utterly to play the golf they can. We've had a jolly good lesson, and it serves us jolly well right. Okay, so the mood, this more than anything captures the mood. We had a secretary at Hoylake called Guy Farrer, who was probably our greatest secretary in many ways, and he wrote a history of Hoylake, the Royal Liverpool Golf Club, in 1933, and this is a passage from that particular book. It ended in a triumph for the United States, a triumph from which we have not yet recovered, and it laid the foundations of the present inferiority complex which grew stronger with every American victory. Mercifully, the future was hidden from us in 1921, otherwise at the present. So they're getting a bit involved with this, I think, but it is an emotional game. So after the match, they all had dinner in the clubhouse, and this is a signed order of play card from the singles, and it's signed by every player in the match, and it's inscribed to Mr. John Graham, the father of the finest golfer there ever was in the world. And most of you won't have heard of Jack Graham Jr., but Jack Graham Jr. was a great golfer from Hoylake, and he was with Hilton and Ball. He was one of the great triumvirate of Hoylake amateurs, and he was described as the best player never to have won an amateur championship. And he made the semi-final 5 times in the amateur championship, but never won it. And he was killed in battle in 1915 at the Battle of Hooge, and his body was never recovered. And this note is to his father, John Graham Sr., who's a past captain of Hoylake as well. And John Graham Sr. was actually on his deathbed when this note was given to him. And John Graham Sr. died 4 days later at Hoylake. So that's a poignant little note. But right, this gentleman's quite interesting. This is Sir Sebastian Stewart, and he was the captain at Hoylake at the time. And in the history of Hoylake, we've had quite a few sitting MPs who have been captains of the club. Sadly, all of them were Conservatives, but he was one of the die-hard Conservatives who forced the end of Lloyd George's coalition government, and he was knighted in 1924. But he was a fairly uncompromising man, and at the time of the 1921 match, the Irish War of Independence was absolutely raging. So he would have had quite a lot on display. Okay, right. This is quite interesting. This is, you know, I was aware that it is recorded that the Americans were presented with cigarette cases because everyone smoked, and they were all gifted these cigarette cases in the autumn of 1921, and we certainly didn't have one at Hoylake, and I'd never seen one, and I sort of trawled about through contacts, and I got an image of one, quite luckily in an auction site, and this is an image, it's not very clear here this evening, of Francis Ouimet's cigarette case. And he sold all his stuff in America at an online auction a couple of years ago, and this was part of it. And it's engraved with all the American player's name, and it's absolutely fantastic. And this year we've had a replica made at Hoylake of this particular silver case. I call them silver cases rather than silver cigarette boxes. We've had some replicas made, and they are on display next to the Walker Cup trophy itself, and they look absolutely fantastic. Okay, we got some thank you letters, all saying they had a jolly good time. We've got 4 thank you letters. That's Ouimet. This is BobbyJones' first international thank you letter, which is great. These were lost at the bottom of a safe for about 30 years at Hoylake, and we had a new secretary, and he had a bit of a clear out, and he said, "Have you seen these?" And I said, "No, I haven't seen these." And they probably hadn't been displayed for probably 30 years, and but they're now on display, and I think they're absolutely fantastic. So sorry, that's have I jumped on that? Yeah. The other thing to note is that 3 of the letters are to the Honourable Kirsten Stewart MP. Evans wrote straight to the House of Commons, you know, straightforward, House of Commons, London, England. That got there, but the others are all, they all say Hoylake, Lancashire, England. And for those of you who are familiar with Hoylake, you will know that Hoylake is and always has been in Cheshire. So they've got the wrong county, but it must have had something to do with disembarking at Liverpool that put them off. But those letters are great. Okay, I was going to say something to go through the achievements of some of these great men would be absolutely impossible, and but I thought I'd mention a couple of them, partly for St Andrew's connections, but partly because they're great men as well. And this is Roger Wethered, and Roger Wethered was with Tolley one of the hugely influential men in British golf until well after the Second War. And 3 weeks after the amateur championship at Hoylake in 1921, some members of the team, including Tolley and Weatherid, came up to the Open Championship at St Andrews. And Weatherid did really quite well, and he was pretty steady after 36 holes, and he finished, he was 1-4-2 for the last 36 holes, and he tied Jock Hutchinson. And they were, as a tie, they were then due to have a 36-hole playoff the following day. And Weatherid was reluctant in the extreme to participate in the playoff, as he'd arranged to play cricket the following day in London. And he was persuaded at great length by the RNA to play in the playoff, which he did. And sadly, he was beaten heavily in the playoff by Jock Hutchinson. Jock Hutchinson, he was a native St Andrean, and although he was part of the American contingent of professionals that came over in 1921, they played a match at Glen Eagles, and although he was born and bred in St Andrews, he was a US citizen, and so a lot of these teams were actually Scottish, but they were under the banner of the US. So that's a great picture of Weatherid. That was his only amateur championship win at Deal in 1923, and he was elected captain of RNA in 1939, but was unable to take up that particular office because of the war, and he became captain of RNA in 1946. This is one of my favourite pictures. This has nothing to do with 1921. This is 1930, and this is BobbyJones driving off in the Open at Hoylake, which is a great picture. But Jones also came up to the Open Championship at St Andrews in 1921, and he was doing okay after 36 holes, and he was 1-5-2 after 36 holes, and he went out in the third round, and he went out in 46, and he had a 6 at the 10th, and he hit it into the greenside bunker at the short 11th hole, and he took 4 shots to get out. He got the ball out, and he walked up to the ball on the green, he picked it up, and no return. And he retired ignominiously in shame. And this has been reported on many times since. And Henry Lonker said if it had been anyone else but BobbyJones, no one would have even bothered about it. But most of the information about that, they say, Jones hit a ball into the Eden, or Jones just walked in, or Jones did this, Jones did. No one's really sure what Jones did, and even writing retrospectively, there are conflictions about what actually happened on that day. Jones played his first and last competitive rounds in the UK at Hoylake, 1921 and 1930, and the impish, hugely talented, temperamental 19-year-old of 1921 became the studied, tense champion. He anxiously follows his drive of 1930. This was the second leg of the Grand Slam at Hoylake before he returned to America to win the US Open and the US Amateur. BobbyJones, certainly the best player of his generation, arguably the greatest of them all. So that brings us on to the Walker Cup, and this is George Herbert Walker, and he was a banker and businessman from St. Louis, Missouri, and he was the USGA president in 1920, as I mentioned before, and he was very keen to get an international golf championship going, and he then proposed that they should have a trophy, and the trophy initially was called the United States Golf Association International Challenge Trophy. And when the press heard about the trophy, they immediately dubbed it the Walker Cup, and it became known as the Walker Cup. And the trophy was actually completed several days in 1921 before the match at Hoylake, the 1921 match at Hoylake. So the trophy was there, and he was desperate to get people to play for it and whatnot. And they sent out a letter to all known golfing nations in 1921, later 1921, and they didn't get any response in the affirmative, and so there were no takers. And Henry Gullen's response on behalf of Norman Bose was pivotal in what eventually happened, and his pragmatic and courteous response to the original invitation I'll mention to you. Gullen says, "My committee appreciates Mr. Walker's gift of an international golf trophy and is confident that in presenting it, he was actuated by a sincere desire to benefit the game. But after very careful consideration, my committee is of the opinion that there are at present only two countries, yours and ours, which could meantime compete. The time is not right for such an international competition. And to add that, we all appreciated very much your country having sent over a team this year, and we certainly hope in the near future to be able to reciprocate. And we're confident that such keen rivalry between our two countries is of inestimable benefit to the game." And this letter sort of sets up the invitation that eventually came in 1922 for a team from the UK to go over to America and actually compete for the first Walker Cup. So the Walker Cup became a competition between, or it became a match between Great Britain and America in 1922, and they played the first match at the National Golf Links, Long Island, New York. There are a few things to consider. There were several sort of factors and coincidences which led to the match of 1921, and the drive and the determination of W.C. Phones to play golf internationally was certainly the catalyst. The Norman Bose and the fledgling R&A Championship Committee, they could easily have declined the Americans or made it difficult for them, but they were quite brave to actually say, no, we'll abandon the Scotland-England game and we'll welcome the Americans instead. So they're to be congratulated as well. Certainly prior to the formation of that committee, that may well not have happened. I mean, things happened very slowly at St Andrews prior to 1920. It still happens quite slowly, some would argue, but the things didn't get done at St Andrews until 1920. And George Herbert Walker's original hope of a truly, his vision of a truly international competition never really came to fruition. But his influence as president of the USGA in 1920 was fairly crucial to the sequence of events. In retrospect, we can really only surmise what would have happened to the Walker Cup had the events of the 1921 golf match not taken place. It could have become an annual fixture between America and Canada, who had already opposed each other, or it could have been a triangular tournament between Canada, America, and the UK, or what I think Walker really envisaged was something like the Eisenhower Trophy of today, a sort of nations international tournament. And although the original themes and formats of what happened in 1921 owed much to chance in the beginning. At Hoylake, we are very grateful that our club was involved and played a small part in what would become one of golf's finest contests. So, to get out of the past, we'll have a look at the future. Unfortunately, you can't really see the colours, but so in just over 3 weeks' time, the 47th Walker Cup will be held at Hoylake, and I'm reliably informed that there are still some tickets available. So if you want to come down to the northwest of England, it is an old ticket, but you'd be ever so welcome. And I think of the Walker Cup in 3 weeks' time, and I wonder what the players of 1921 would actually think of that particular match and what's happened to golf over the last 100 years. And I'm sure they would be absolutely enthralled with the Pro V1, but they would be bemused with Twitter feeds, emails, TV cameras, and the World Amateur Golf Rankings. As we look forward to this year's match, there is already much debate on who's going to get picked, who's going to be selected, and the relative merits of amateur golf on both sides of the Atlantic. It is certain that the fine traditions of sportsmanship and camaraderie that have characterized the Walker Cup for nearly 100 years will be maintained. Thank you.